Jake Morrison lay flat on his back, staring at the cracked ceiling of his metal shop. The concrete floor was cold against his spine, but he didn't care anymore. In his right hand, he clutched a piece of paper that had destroyed everything he'd worked for. Bankruptcy. The word kept echoing in his head like a bad song he couldn't stop. 20 years. That's how long he'd been running this fabrication shop on Station Artemis 7. 20 years of welding, cutting, shaping metal for alien clients who came from every corner of the galaxy. He'd been good at it too. Really good. His custom work had a reputation. When someone needed precision parts that the big automated factories couldn't match, they came to Jake Morrison's shop. But that was before the Velthic Corporation rolled out their new manufacturing systems. Machines that could pump out parts in half the time for a quarter of the price. Sure, the quality wasn't quite as good, but most clients didn't care. Good enough was good enough when it saved them money. Jake had watched his client list shrink month by month. First the small jobs disappeared. Then the medium ones. Finally, even his loyal customers started making excuses about budgets and timelines. 3 weeks ago, his last client had picked up their order. Since then, nothing. Just silence and the hum of empty machinery. He tried everything. Dropped his prices until he was barely breaking even. Offered faster turnaround times. Even tried advertising on the station's commercial networks. Nothing worked. The galaxy had moved on, and guys like him who still believed in doing things right instead of doing things fast were dinosaurs headed for extinction. The worst part wasn't the money, though that was bad enough. He'd maxed out 3 credit lines trying to keep the doors open. Station management was threatening eviction. His equipment would be seized and auctioned off to pay debts. But what really hurt was the feeling that everything he'd built, all that skill and experience, just didn't matter anymore. Jake let the bankruptcy notice fall from his hand. It drifted to the floor and lay there like a tombstone. He thought about getting up, maybe grabbing a drink from the storage room, but couldn't find the energy. What was the point? Tomorrow he'd have to start packing. Have to figure out where to go, what to do. Maybe sign on with one of the big corporations as an assembly line worker. The thought made him sick. A sound broke through his spiral of misery. Scratching. Something was scratching at the loading bay door. Jake ignored it. Probably just debris blown against the metal by the station's recycling fans. The lower levels where his shop was located always had trash floating around. Nobody cleaned down here much anymore. But the scratching continued. And then he heard something else. A sound that was almost like crying but not quite human. More like a bird's chirp mixed with a whimper. High-pitched and desperate. Despite himself, Jake felt something stir. Some basic human instinct that responded to distress calls. He'd always been like that even as a kid. Couldn't walk past a stray dog without checking if it was okay. His ex-wife used to tease him about it, called him a softie with a hard shell. The scratching got more frantic. Whatever was out there wasn't giving up. Damn it, Jake muttered, hauling himself to his feet. His knees cracked from lying on the cold floor too long. He shuffled toward the loading bay, not really caring what he'd find. Maybe it was some station kid's pet that got loose. Maybe it was one of those weird alien creatures that sometimes escaped from the upper-level labs. He hit the button and the bay door groaned upward about 2 feet. That's all the power he had left in the system. He'd had to cut the hydraulics to partial to save on electricity costs. Something small tumbled through the gap the moment it was wide enough. Jake stared. It was a dragon. An actual, honest-to-God dragon hatchling. No bigger than a house cat, with scales the color of old brass coins. But those scales were dull and dirty, covered in what looked like engine grease and dried blood. The wings were crumpled against its sides, one of them torn and hanging at a weird angle. The creature's ribs showed through its thin hide like prison bars. The dragon lifted its head and looked at Jake with eyes way too big for its starved face. Those eyes held something Jake recognized immediately because he'd seen it in his own mirror that morning. Desperation. The look of someone who'd reached the absolute end and had nowhere left to go. Then the little dragon made that sound again. That crying, chirping, whimpering noise. It was begging. Asking for help from the only person who'd opened a door. Jake knelt down slowly, not wanting to scare the creature. Dragons were rare. Incredibly rare. The big noble houses bred them as status symbols and living tools. They used them as navigators on fancy ships, as power sources for weapons systems, as guards for their compounds. A healthy dragon was worth more than Jake would make in 10 lifetimes. This one was clearly a reject. Jake could see the imperfections now that he was close. The scales weren't uniform. One horn was shorter than the other. The tail had a kink in it that bent to the left. Whoever owned this dragon had decided it wasn't worth keeping and dumped it somewhere to die. Someone threw you away too, huh? Jake said softly. The dragon chirped again, weaker this time. It was fading fast. Jake made a decision. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe it was just delaying his own problems. But he couldn't walk away from something that needed help. Not when he knew exactly how it felt to be discarded. He scooped up the trembling creature as gently as he could. It was so light, mostly bones and papery wing membrane. The dragon didn't fight or try to bite. It just curled into his hands and made a sound that might have been relief. "All right, little guy," Jake said, carrying the dragon toward his workbench. "Let's see if we can't fix you up." For the first time in weeks, Jake Morrison had something to do besides give up. Jake spent the first night just trying to keep the dragon alive. He cleared off his main workbench and made a nest out of thermal blankets he normally used to cover sensitive equipment. The little creature was so cold, its scales felt like ice against his palms. He cranked up the shop's heating system, not caring about the power bill anymore. What did it matter when he was losing everything anyway? Finding food was the next problem. What did baby dragons even eat? Jake had no idea. He tried searching the station's data network, but most information about dragon care was locked behind expensive subscription walls or classified by the breeding houses. Typical. They kept everything secret so nobody could compete with them. He settled on trying different things. Protein paste from his emergency rations got ignored. Dried meat made the dragon gag. But when Jake heated up some mineral-rich coolant fluid he used for his machines, the dragon's head perked up. The little thing lapped it down like it was dying of thirst. Maybe dragons needed metal compounds or something. Jake made a mental note to try grinding up some copper shavings into the next batch. He named the dragon Bolt because of a lightning-shaped scar on its snout. Looked like someone had hit it with something hot. The thought made Jake's jaw tighten with anger. Day 2, Bolt was strong enough to lift its head and look around. Those big eyes watched everything Jake did with intense focus. When Jake worked on a broken hydraulic pump, just keeping his hands busy, Bolt followed every movement like a student watching a master. Day 3, the dragon managed to stand on shaky legs. The injured wing still dragged, but Bolt hopped from the blanket nest to the edge of the workbench. Small victory, but it felt huge. Day 4, Jake fabricated a tiny brace for the damaged wing using memory polymer wire, the same stuff he used for flexible joints in robotic systems. He worked slowly, talking to Bolt the whole time, explaining what he was doing. The dragon stayed perfectly still while Jake fitted the brace, like it understood this was medicine. Day 5, Bolt fluttered from the floor to the workbench in one clumsy hop flight. The wing brace was working. Jake found himself talking to the dragon more and more. Maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was easier to talk to something that couldn't judge him. He told Bolt about the business failing, about feeling useless in a galaxy that valued speed over quality, about lying on that floor without hope. The dragon would tilt its head and make little chirping sounds, almost like it was responding. Day 6 changed everything. Jake woke up that morning to a sound he hadn't heard in months. His plasma welder was running. He bolted upright from the cot he'd set up in the office, heart pounding. Had someone broken in? Was his equipment being stolen? He rushed into the main shop area and froze. Bolt was sitting on the workbench next to the welder. The dragon had somehow activated it and, more importantly, had used it. Jake stared at a project he'd abandoned months ago, a fusion coupling that required a perfect zero-stress weld. The kind of weld that took years of experience and perfect hand control to achieve. Jake had tried 17 times and failed every attempt. The metal kept warping from heat distribution problems. The coupling now had a flawless weld running along its seam. The metal hadn't warped at all. The joint was absolutely perfect. Jake picked it up with shaking hands and examined it under his magnification lens. The molecular structure was better than anything he'd ever produced. Better than anything he'd seen from the big corporate factories. This was master-level work. Impossible work. He looked at Bolt. The dragon looked back at him with those intelligent eyes and made a trilling sound, almost like a question, asking if Jake approved. "Did you do this?" Jake's voice came out as a whisper. "How did you do this?" Bolt hopped over to another broken piece Jake had left on the bench. An energy regulator with a cracked crystal housing. The dragon stared at it for a long moment, then made that chirping sound that Jake was starting to recognize as concentration. The air around Bolt's head shimmered slightly, and Jake felt the hairs on his arms stand up from some kind of energy field. Then Jake understood. Dragons weren't just rare because they were exotic pets. They were valuable because they could sense and manipulate energy in ways other species couldn't. They could see electromagnetic fields, feel power flows, sense the exact distribution of heat and current. To Bolt, energy was as visible as color was to Jake. The dragon was showing him that it wanted to help. That it could help. Jake pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. His mind was racing. If Bolt could do this kind of precision work, if they could combine Jake's mechanical knowledge with the dragon's energy sense, they could produce things nobody else could match. Not the automated factories. Not the big corporate shops. Nobody. You want to work with me? Jake asked, almost afraid of the answer. Bolt settled onto the workbench, tucked its wings close, and purred. The sound was like wind chimes mixed with a cat's rumble. It meant yes. Over the next week, they developed a system. Jake would study a project and plan out the approach. He'd start the work with his hands and tools. Bolt would watch, and whenever Jake hit a problem, the dragon would chirp or trill or make some sound. At first, Jake didn't understand the signals. But gradually he learned. A sharp chirp meant the angle was wrong. A low trill meant more power was needed. A rising whistle meant decrease heat. A satisfied purr meant everything was perfect. They worked on old projects Jake had given up on. Pieces that were too delicate or too precise for normal methods. Bolt's energy manipulation made the impossible possible. The dragon could hold a welding temperature steady within a single degree. Could sense stress fractures in metal before they became visible. Could guide Jake's hands toward the exact right position through some kind of intuition that Jake didn't fully understand but had learned to trust completely. 2 weeks after finding Bolt on his doorstep, Jake got his first new client. A cargo hauler captain named Rodriguez who'd heard through the grapevine that Morrison's shop was open again. His ship's power converter had a problem that 3 certified technicians couldn't solve. They all said it needed complete replacement. 20,000 credits minimum. Jake and Bolt looked at it together. Jake saw the mechanical problem. Bolt saw the energy flow issue. Working in tandem, they recalibrated the entire system in under 6 hours. It ran better than factory specs. Rodriguez paid triple what Jake asked and left a review on the station network that started with, "I don't know what Morrison's doing differently, but this is the best work I've ever seen." More clients came. Word spread fast in the lower sectors where people still valued craftsmanship. The human mechanic with the mysterious new technique that produced impossible quality. Jake never advertised that he had a dragon partner. Partly because he was worried someone might try to claim Bolt. But mostly because their partnership felt private. Sacred almost. Bolt grew stronger every day. The scales started to shine. The crooked wings straightened out and gained strength. The dragon was becoming beautiful and, more importantly, was choosing to stay. Every evening, Jake and Bolt would sit together in the shop, and Jake would feel something he hadn't felt in years. Oh, purpose. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy hadn't passed him by after all. He'd found a partner. And together they were building something real. 3 months after finding Bolt, Jake's shop was busier than it had been in 5 years. The waiting list for custom jobs stretched out 6 weeks. Money was actually flowing into his accounts instead of draining out. He'd paid off 2 of his 3 credit lines and station management had stopped sending eviction notices. More importantly, he woke up every morning actually wanting to work. Bolt had grown from cat size to the size of a large wolf. The dragon's bronze scales now gleamed like polished metal under the shop lights. Those crumpled wings had filled out and could lift Bolt clear across the workshop in a single leap. The dragon moved with confidence now, no longer the starving reject that had tumbled through his door. But the best part was the intelligence in those eyes. Bolt understood everything. Not just the work, but Jake's moods, his worries, his rare moments of genuine happiness. They developed a reputation across 5 sectors of the station. The human craftsman who could do impossible work. Nobody knew about Bolt's involvement because Jake was careful. The dragon would hide in the back office whenever clients came to pick up orders. Jake told himself it was for security reasons, but deep down he knew the truth. He was afraid someone would recognize Bolt as stolen property and try to take his partner away. Their work had evolved into something almost artistic. Jake would design the solution using his decades of mechanical knowledge. Bolt would add the energy component that made everything work better. Crystal alignments that should have taken days of micro-adjustments would lock into perfect harmony in hours. Fusion welds that normally required cleanroom conditions came out flawless in Jake's dusty shop. Energy systems hummed with an efficiency that made engineers shake their heads in disbelief. The clients came from everywhere now. Wealthy traders who could afford corporate prices but wanted quality instead of quantity. Independent ship captains who'd been burned by automated repair systems. Even a few aliens from species Jake had never met before, drawn by word of mouth about the human who could fix anything. Then came the job that changed everything. A woman named Patricia Kowalski showed up at the shop one evening just before closing. She wore the uniform of a colony administrator, looked exhausted, and had the desperate edge in her voice that Jake recognized from his own darkest days. "I need help," she said without preamble. "Our atmosphere processor is failing. We've got 3,000 people breathing recycled air, and the main reactor has a fault inside the core chamber." Jake pulled up the technical specs she provided and felt his stomach drop. The fault was deep in the system's heart, surrounded by radiation shielding and active plasma conduits. You couldn't access it without shutting down the entire processor. And if you shut it down, 3,000 people would run out of breathable air in about 6 hours. "Every corporate tech we've called says it's impossible," Patricia continued. Her hands were shaking. "They want us to evacuate the colony while they install a new processor. But we don't have the ships for a full evacuation. We don't have the money for a new processor. We've got maybe 48 hours before people start suffocating." Jake stared at the specs for a long time. The problem was clear enough. A microfracture in the reactor's containment field was bleeding energy into the cooling system. It needed to be sealed from the inside, but the heat in that chamber would melt any tool or protective suit within seconds. This was genuinely impossible by normal standards. He felt Bolt press against his leg. The dragon had been listening from the doorway. Jake looked down and saw something in Bolt's eyes. Not just willingness but confidence. The dragon was telling him they could do this. "Give me an hour to study this," Jake told Patricia. "Don't promise anything to your people yet, but don't give up either." After she left, Jake spread the technical diagrams across every surface in the shop. Bolt hopped up onto the main workbench and studied them too, head tilting back and forth as the dragon processed the information. "This is crazy," Jake said out loud. "We'd need to work inside an active reactor. The heat alone would kill me in seconds." Bolt made a low rumbling sound and pressed a clawed foot against one of the diagrams. An image formed in Jake's mind. Not words exactly but understanding. Bolt could manipulate energy fields. Heat was just energy. The dragon could create a localized cooling effect, dampening the reactor's heat in a small bubble around them while they worked. "You sure about this?" Jake asked. "If you lose concentration for even a second, we're both dead." Bolt's eyes met his with absolute certainty. The dragon had never been more sure of anything. Jake called Patricia back and told her they'd take the job. They arrived at the colony the next morning. The atmosphere processor was a massive installation buried in the moon's surface, all thick pipes and humming machinery. The air already tasted stale. People moved through the corridors with forced calm, but Jake could see the fear underneath. The reactor chamber was exactly as bad as the specs suggested. Radiation warnings covered every surface. The heat shimmer was visible even through the observation window. Jake suited up in his best protective gear, though he knew it wouldn't matter if Bolt's plan failed. They went in together. The moment the inner door sealed behind them, the temperature spiked. Jake felt sweat pour down his face. Then Bolt closed those big eyes and concentrated. The air around them suddenly cooled to bearable levels. Jake could feel the dragon's energy manipulation like a physical presence, a bubble of controlled temperature in an ocean of killing heat. They worked for 6 hours straight. Jake's hands moved with trained precision, sealing the microfractures with specialized compounds while Bolt held the heat at bay. Every time Jake's hands started to shake from fatigue, he'd feel Bolt's presence steady him. When the radiation levels spiked, Bolt would adjust the energy bubble to shield them. They moved like one organism, human hands and dragon energy working in perfect sync. When they finally sealed the last fracture, Jake was so exhausted he could barely stand. Bolt guided him back to the exit, maintaining the protective bubble until they were clear. The processor stabilized within minutes. The colony's air quality readings returned to normal. 3,000 people were safe. Patricia tried to pay them double what they'd agreed on. Jake refused the extra and settled for the original price plus fuel costs. But what happened next was worth more than any amount of money. Every single person in that colony wrote a review, posted testimonials on the galactic network, told everyone they knew about the human mechanic and his mysterious partner who'd saved their lives when the big corporations had abandoned them. The shop's communication system crashed from the flood of new job requests. Orders came from colonies, independent stations, even a few military contractors who'd heard about work that exceeded their own specifications. Jake had to start turning down jobs because they couldn't keep up with demand. That night, sitting in the shop with Bolt curled up on the reinforced workbench they'd built for the dragon's growing size, Jake felt something strange. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling because he hadn't experienced it in so long. Pride. Real, genuine pride in his work. Not just satisfaction but the knowledge that what he and Bolt were building together actually mattered. They weren't just fixing machines. They were helping people that the big systems had left behind. Bolt purred and stretched those magnificent wings, now strong enough to carry the dragon's full weight. The bronze scales caught the light and shimmered with inner fire. "We're actually doing something important," Jake said quietly. "Building something that lasts." Bolt's response was a harmonic trill that Jake had learned meant complete agreement. They had found their purpose together. And the galaxy was starting to notice. The legal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by two armed security contractors who looked like they meant business. Jake was calibrating a power cell when they walked into his shop without knocking. Bolt, now the size of a small horse, lifted its head from where it had been resting near the fusion welder. One of the contractors handed Jake a data pad. The other kept his hand near his weapon and his eyes locked on Bolt. Jake read the document once, then again because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hands started shaking halfway through the second read. Property reclamation notice. House Valmont Industries. Genetic markers confirmed. One juvenile dragon, bronze coloration, registered as lost inventory 3 months prior. Immediate return demanded. Penalties for unauthorized possession and theft of corporate property. Fines for improper care of noble livestock totaling 47,000 credits. Livestock. They called Bolt livestock. "You've got 24 hours to surrender the asset," the first contractor said in a bored tone, like he did this every day. "Cooperation will minimize legal consequences." Jake looked at Bolt. The dragon had gone completely still, but Jake could see the tension in every muscle. Bolt understood. Maybe not the legal details, but the threat was crystal clear. These people wanted to take the dragon away. "Get out of my shop," Jake said quietly. The second contractor smirked. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. House Valmont has full legal documentation. That dragon is registered property. You're just some mechanic who found lost goods." "Bolt isn't property," Jake's voice came out harder than he intended. "And I'm not giving up my partner." "Your partner?" The first contractor actually laughed. "It's a tool, buddy. Expensive biotechnology. You might as well claim to be partners with a plasma cutter." Bolt growled. It wasn't loud because the dragon was still young, not fully mature. But the sound carried something that made every piece of equipment in the shop vibrate in sympathy. The lights flickered. The fusion welder hummed to life on its own. Metal surfaces rang like bells. Both contractors stepped back, hands moving to their weapons. Jake grabbed a plasma torch from his workbench and ignited it. The blue flame cast sharp shadows across his face. "I said get out." For a long moment, nobody moved. Jake knew this was stupid. These weren't thugs he could scare off. They represented a massive corporation with lawyers and security forces. But he couldn't back down. Not when they were talking about Bolt like the dragon was just inventory to be recovered. The standoff broke when station security burst through the door. Not to arrest Jake, which is what he expected. To escort the Valmont contractors out. The lead security officer was a woman Jake vaguely recognized from the lower sectors. "You boys got a warrant?" she asked the contractors. "We have corporate documentation of ownership," the first one protested. "That's not a warrant. And we've got about 60 formal complaints filed against your presence in the last 10 minutes. Seems like Mr. Morrison here has a lot of friends who don't appreciate armed thugs showing up in their neighborhood." Jake blinked in surprise. 60 complaints? In 10 minutes? The contractors left, but the first one's parting words made Jake's blood run cold. "House Valmont always recovers its property. We'll be back with proper documentation. Enjoy your last day with that dragon." After they were gone, the security officer turned to Jake. Her nameplate read Officer Linda Chin. Wait, no, that wasn't right. Jake's tired brain caught up. Officer Rita Voss. "You've got a problem," Rita said bluntly. "Valmont's one of the big breeding houses. They've got resources and lawyers. If they can prove genetic ownership, which they probably can, you're in deep trouble." "They threw Bolt away," Jake said. His voice cracked slightly. "The dragon was starving to death in the lower levels. They dumped their reject and now they want to take credit for everything we've built." Rita looked at Bolt, who had moved to stand next to Jake. The dragon's head was level with Jake's shoulder now. "That's the problem with the current laws. Dragons are classified as property, not people. Doesn't matter that your dragon clearly has intelligence. Legally speaking, it's the same as someone reclaiming a stolen vehicle." Over the next hour, Jake's communication system exploded with messages. Every client they'd ever helped was reaching out. The cargo captain whose converter they'd fixed. The colony administrator whose people they'd saved. Independent traders, small business owners, even a few corporate engineers who'd been impressed by their work. All of them offering support, testimony, money for legal fees. Patricia Kowalski, the colony administrator, sent a message that brought tears to Jake's eyes. 3,000 people are alive because of you and Bolt. Whatever you need, we're there. But the support didn't change the fundamental problem. House Valmont had the law on their side. Dragons were property. The breeding houses had spent decades making sure the legal system protected their investments. This wasn't going to be solved by public opinion or loyal clients. Jake spent that night researching dragon law, which was depressing as hell. Case after case of breeding houses successfully reclaiming dragons, even from people who'd cared for them for years. The corporations always won. Always. Bolt curled around Jake's chair while he read, the dragon's warmth a comfort against the cold reality of what they were facing. Around midnight, Jake closed his data pad and looked at his partner. They're going to take you, he said quietly. The law's on their side. I don't know how to fight this. Bolt made a sound Jake had never heard before. A complex harmonic that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then the dragon did something unexpected. Bolt placed one clawed foot on Jake's abandoned data pad and pushed it toward him insistently. Jake didn't understand at first. Then Bolt made the sound again and Jake felt something in his mind. Not words but concepts. Intelligence. Communication. Personhood. You want to speak for yourself, Jake whispered, understanding flooding through him. Bolt's eyes gleamed with determination. The next morning, Jake contacted the sector tribunal and filed for an emergency hearing. Not to dispute ownership, which he'd lose, but to request a competency evaluation. If Bolt could demonstrate sapience, full intelligent awareness, then the property laws wouldn't apply. You couldn't own a person no matter what their genetic markers said. House Valmont responded within hours. Their legal team arrived that afternoon, led by a woman in an expensive suit who looked at Jake like he was something stuck to her shoe. Her name was Victoria Hammond, senior counsel for Valmont's recovery division. This is a waste of everyone's time, Victoria said coldly. Dragons are not sapient. They're trained animals with complex instincts. We've been breeding them for 200 years. We know what they are. Then you won't mind if Bolt gets a chance to prove otherwise, Jake shot back. Victoria's smile was sharp and unpleasant. Actually, I'm looking forward to it. When your dragon fails this ridiculous competency test, the penalties for this stunt will triple. We'll take the dragon and everything you own. Jake looked at Bolt. The dragon met his eyes and made that harmonic sound again. Trust me, the sound seemed to say. The hearing was set for 3 days later. Jake had bet everything on Bolt's ability to prove personhood. If the dragon failed, Jake would lose his partner, his shop, and probably his freedom. It was the biggest gamble of his life. And there was no going back now. The sector tribunal chamber was packed. Jake hadn't expected that. He'd thought this would be a quiet legal hearing with a few officials and lawyers. Instead, every seat was filled. Standing room only along the back walls. He recognized faces from the crowd. Patricia Kowalski from the colony. Captain Rodriguez, who'd been his first client after Bolt arrived. Dozens of others they'd helped over the past months. Even people Jake had never met, apparently drawn by news coverage of the case. House Valmont had brought an army. 6 lawyers in expensive suits, all carrying data pads and looking confident. Victoria Hammond sat at their table like a queen holding court. She'd made it clear outside the chamber that this was a formality before they reclaimed their property. Jake sat alone at his table with Bolt beside him. The dragon was calm, almost unnaturally so. Those intelligent eyes watched everything, missing nothing. The tribunal judge was an older man named Thomas Bradford. He'd been arbitrating sector disputes for 30 years according to Jake's research. Fair but by the book. Not the kind of judge who'd rule on emotion. Judge Bradford called the hearing to order and the chamber fell silent. This is a competency evaluation requested by Jake Morrison regarding a dragon currently in his possession. House Valmont contests this evaluation and asserts property rights. Mr. Morrison, this was your filing. Present your case. Jake stood up. His legs felt shaky. Public speaking had never been his thing. He was a mechanic, not a lawyer. But he'd practiced what he wanted to say for 3 days straight. Your Honor, Bolt isn't property because Bolt is a person. I know how that sounds. The law says dragons are animals, tools bred by corporations. But the law's wrong. I've worked with Bolt every day for 4 months. This isn't a trained animal following commands. This is an intelligent being who thinks, feels, and makes choices. Victoria stood up smoothly. Your Honor, this is sentimental nonsense. Dragons have complex behavioral patterns, yes. They can be trained to perform impressive tasks. But that doesn't make them sapient any more than a well-programmed computer is sapient. House Valmont has genetic documentation proving this dragon is our legally registered property. The emotional attachment Mr. Morrison feels doesn't change reality. Then let Bolt speak, Jake said. His voice came out stronger than he felt. If the dragon is just a dumb animal like you claim, this'll be over in 5 minutes. But if Bolt can demonstrate real intelligence, real communication, then your property claim doesn't matter. You can't own a person. Judge Bradford leaned forward. And how exactly would a dragon speak? They don't have vocal cords for human language. Bolt communicates through harmonics, Jake explained. Sound patterns that can be translated. Every translator system in this room should be able to parse it. The judge considered this, then nodded. Very well. This is highly irregular, but I'll allow it. If the dragon can demonstrate complex communication that goes beyond trained responses, I'll consider it evidence of sapience. Victoria's confident expression flickered for just a moment. She hadn't expected the judge to agree. Jake looked at Bolt and nodded. The dragon stood up from where it had been lying beside Jake's chair. Bolt was magnificent now, bronze scales gleaming under the chamber's lights. The dragon moved to the center of the room where everyone could see clearly. Then Bolt began to speak. The sound was nothing like human speech. It was layered harmonics, multiple frequencies woven together into complex patterns. But every translator in the room started outputting text on their displays. Jake watched his own screen as Bolt's words appeared. I was born in House Valmont Breeding Facility. Batch 742. They ran tests when I was 3 days old. My scales grew wrong pattern. Left horn shorter than right. Tail curved. Failed quality standards. They put me in disposal chute with 6 others from my batch. Thrown away like broken equipment. The chamber was absolutely silent. Even Victoria had gone pale. Bolt continued. The dragon's harmonic voice filled the space with painful honesty. I lived in station lower levels for 2 weeks. Eating garbage. Hiding from maintenance drones. Wing tore on broken metal. I was dying. Then I found Jake's door. He could have ignored me. Could have called Valmont for reward. Instead he gave me food. Fixed my wing. Treated me like I mattered. Jake felt his throat tighten. He'd never heard Bolt describe those first weeks before they met. Jake taught me about working together, Bolt's translated voice continued. Not master giving orders to tool. Partners combining different strengths. I learned to see energy flows. He learned to trust my sight. We made impossible things possible. Not because he owned me. Because we chose to work together. The dragon turned to face Victoria and the Valmont legal team. You say I am property. You have genetic markers as proof. But genetic markers only prove where my body came from. Not who I am. You threw me away when I didn't meet your standards. Jake saw value you couldn't see. Which of you has right to claim me? Victoria stood up abruptly. Your Honor, this is clearly a trained routine. Morrison has spent months teaching the dragon to produce these sounds. It's impressive conditioning, I'll admit, but it's not sapience. It's performance. Judge Bradford held up his hand for silence. Then he looked directly at Bolt. Dragon, I'm going to ask you a question you couldn't have prepared for. What is your opinion of this legal proceeding? Bolt tilted its head, considering. Then the dragon spoke again. This proceeding is necessary but sad. Necessary because current laws treat thinking beings as objects. Sad because it should be obvious I am person. You don't need special tests to see consciousness. You only need to look in someone's eyes and recognize awareness looking back. Humans know this instinctively. But your legal systems built walls around that instinct. Created categories that let you ignore what you see. I understand why. If dragons are people, entire industries collapse. Easier to maintain comfortable lie than face uncomfortable truth. The judge's eyebrows had risen higher with each word. He looked at his translator screen, then back at Bolt, then at the screen again. That was not a trained response, Bradford said slowly. That was analysis and original thought. He turned to Victoria. Counsel, do you have any evidence that this dragon has been specifically trained to answer philosophical questions about legal theory? Victoria's mouth opened and closed. She had nothing. Judge Bradford sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. The entire chamber held its breath. Finally he spoke. I've been a judge for 30 years. I've heard thousands of cases. This is the first time I've had to question fundamental assumptions about personhood and property. He looked at Bolt. But after hearing this dragon speak, I cannot in good conscience classify a being with this level of self-awareness as property. The law may define dragons as animals, but the law is clearly inadequate. Victoria stood up quickly. Your Honor, you can't just ignore established legal precedent based on one conversation. This sets a dangerous precedent that threatens an entire industry. Then perhaps that industry needs to be threatened, Bradford said sharply. I'm ruling that this dragon has demonstrated sapience and self-determination. House Valmont's property claim is denied. Furthermore, I'm forwarding this case to the sector legislature with a recommendation that dragon classification laws be reviewed immediately. The chamber erupted. People cheering, Valmont lawyers arguing loudly, reporters rushing for the exits to file their stories. Jake just stood there in shock. They'd won. Actually won. Bolt moved back to Jake's side and pressed against his leg. The dragon made a quiet sound only Jake could hear. A sound that meant relief and gratitude and home. The next 4 months were chaotic. Judge Bradford's ruling hit the galactic news networks like a bomb. Other dragons started demanding freedom. 7 breeding houses filed emergency appeals. 3 collapsed entirely when their livestock walked away and couldn't be legally stopped. Some dragons stayed with the families who'd raised them, forming real partnerships based on choice rather than ownership. Others struck out alone, exploring a galaxy they'd only seen through their owner's eyes. Dragon rights groups formed overnight. Legal battles erupted on dozens of worlds. Jake and Bolt became famous, which neither of them enjoyed. But they used the attention to help other dragons and their human partners navigate the new legal landscape. Their shop became a meeting place, a symbol of what cooperation between species could create. They kept taking jobs too. The colony repairs. The delicate calibrations. The impossible fixes that required human skill and dragon energy sense working together. They trained others, teaching that true quality came from mutual respect, not dominance and control. Jake sometimes thought back to lying on that concrete floor 4 months ago, broken and hopeless. That version of him seemed like a different person now. Because he was. Bolt had saved his life just as much as he'd saved Bolt's. On quiet evenings after the clients had left and the shop was peaceful, they'd sit together and work on projects that interested them. Not for money or reputation. Just because creating something beautiful together felt right. Bolt had grown into full magnificence now. Bronze scales that shimmered with inner fire. Wings powerful enough to lift the dragon's full weight. But those eyes remained the same. Intelligent, kind, and absolutely certain about the choice to stay. You could go anywhere now, Jake said one evening. You're free. Protected by law. You could explore the galaxy, find other dragons, do whatever you want. Bolt made that harmonic sound that meant complete contentment. The translation wasn't necessary. Jake understood. This was home. Not the building or the equipment. The partnership. The trust. The work they built together. Freedom wasn't about going somewhere else. It was about choosing where you belonged. And Bolt had chosen to stay.